everybody. It's Brian Malow, and this is But Seriously, Dinosaurs. What do I even have to say more than that? Dinosaur. Who doesn't love dinosaurs? Everybody loves dinosaurs. But if we could have dinosaurs back today, alive amongst us, as in Jurassic Park, well, we saw how that turned out, right? There was a lot of cool stuff there. Doesn't end well in movie after movie. Sure, they squeak by with a happy ending, but people die. Terrible things happen. Is Jurassic Park just pure fantasy, or is there any possible? It always seemed reasonable. Why couldn't we extract some blood from a mosquito stuck in amber millions of years ago? Why shouldn't we be able to get that and bring extinct creatures back to life? And what about creatures that aren't as old as dinosaurs? What about something like the dodo or the woolly mammoth or the carrier pigeon? But as Jeff Goldblum famously said in the first Jurassic Park movie, you were so busy, worrying about whether you could do it, you didn't worry about whether you should do it. Well, joining me right now is an historian of science and the author of a brand new book, which is Ancient DNA: The Making of a Celebrity Science. And this book comes out tomorrow. Elizabeth, thanks for joining me. This is covering my face. I was supposed to have it on the wider shot. But hi, how are you?
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So how exciting. This is your first book and it comes out tomorrow. What does
Yeah,
that
it
feel
is.
like?
Well, so I'm a first-time author. This is my first book, and I have been warned by other seasoned authors that your release day is anticlimactic because nothing really happens. It just goes on the bookshelves, or if you've ordered it, it'll be at your doorstep. So I'm excited to be here talking with you because it kicks off my book release week rather nicely.
Yeah. So very exciting. I mentioned you're not a scientist. You're a historian of science. Like my friend and former colleague and your current colleague, Paul Brinkman, over at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Although like him, you've spent a lot of time around paleontologists. You've been involved in some field work with paleontologists. You're doing a postdoc right now. You have a PhD in, I know you studied philosophy and history, but then when you did your actual PhD, was that specifically in history?
Yeah, so it was in
Yeah.
science and technology studies, which
Whoa.
is really about uh, the study of anything doing with science and technology and how it happens. So, the best way to describe it is that I'm an expert on how science happens, who gets to do it, how it gets done, what doesn't get done, and then why it matters to people like us and broader society.
Yeah. So, let's I have so many questions for you. We'll talk about the book, obviously, and why it's a celebrity science, as you called it, the making of a celebrity science. So the topic is ancient DNA, but before we get there to you writing this first book of yours, let me get a little background on you. So, well, let me go way back. Did you always know history was always a tough subject for me? So did you always know that you might want to be a historian? Were you leaning that way? What did you want to be when you grew up, when you were littler?
Yeah, that's an embarrassing question to answer, but I will answer it just for you. So funny you said that. Everyone loves dinosaurs. So actually, when I was little, I never wanted to be a paleontologist. Never really had any interest in dinosaurs. Didn't know much about them. Never wanted to study them. And when I was little, I wanted to be a backup singer for Michael Bolton.
Very
And that was
specific.
yeah, very
Not just a
specific. Yeah,
background singer, but for Michael Bolton.
Yeah, my parents took me to a concert when I was, I think, 7, and so that was my dream. It took me a while to figure out that I couldn't sing at all, so that's not what I ended up doing. But I really just fell into history. I was good at it. I loved it. I had an amazing high school teacher in a small rural town where I grew up. And then when I went to NC State, I had to take a science elective, and I wasn't a science kind of person. So I took a class called Dinosaurian World, because I thought, well, I've never been interested in dinosaurs, don't know anything about them, so let's just take this course, fulfill an elective. The course was taught by Mary Schweitzer, which I know you know her, but for our audience who doesn't, she is a extremely famous scientist. She's led some pioneering efforts in molecular paleontology for trying to extract ancient proteins from dinosaur fossils. Her work is really controversial, but I took this course and it was so hard, but I loved it. And I ended up digging up dinosaurs in Montana with her one summer. I took a number of other courses, and just spent a lot of time doing lab work and field work. And what was really embarrassing about my introduction into ancient DNA is that when I was taking a course with Mary, I was an undergrad, and I saw this special on TV. I think it was maybe Discovery Channel, and it said, we're doing an exclusive 1 hour documentary on a scientist who has discovered ancient proteins from a T-Rex bone. And I thought, that's crazy. Like, ancient proteins from a T-Rex bone, like that, they shouldn't survive that long. And I went into class and I asked Mary, I said, did you see this crazy documentary about this crazy scientist who's trying to extract, molecules from fossils? And she just smiled and said, why don't you watch it? And then we can talk about it later. And I watched it and I was mortified because she was the scientist that they were interviewing and I had no idea.
Yeah.
So I went into class the next day and I was completely embarrassed, and she thought it was pretty funny. And
Yeah.
that was my intro. And this is why I thought, this is amazing stuff. It's super controversial and I want to get into it, and I want to figure out, how do scientists start thinking about extracting molecules from fossils when no one has ever done it before? So that's the history of it that I wrote.
Excellent. Yeah, I worked, I came to Raleigh to work at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and I spent about 4 years there, and Mary was there. And yes, so I was aware that was her research, very contentious. A lot of people, maybe you can bring me a little up to speed on what people are thinking, because all my information is like 7 years old or so. And she was finding evidence of proteins that in very old fossils that the thinking was that they shouldn't I guess maintain their integrity for that long. But you know what? We have a couple comments, and actually, so here, Fred would like to know, where's the small town that you grew up in? Where did you? Yeah.
Okay, I can answer that one. Mount Pleasant, North Carolina. So not to be confused with Mount Pleasant, South Carolina.
And Aaron Freeman said he'd love to hear about her book. Well, lucky for you, Aaron, because that's what she's here to talk about. Let's see. See, here comes Fred again. One study led by Mary Schweitzer, a paleontologist from NC State, who's chased dinosaur proteins for decades, confirms her highly controversial claim to have recovered 80-million-year-old dinosaur collagen. So collagen protein, is collagen a kind of protein? Or I know you're not a scientist, so
That's right.
So I'll say this, I encourage everyone to send in any questions or comments you have, but understand that Elizabeth isn't a scientist, she's a historian, and she studies the people who study the science, right?
That's right.
So she has some stories to tell, and she's obviously learned a bit about the science in her time. But let me ask you, so what are you doing now at the museum? I know that you previously had a postdoc working with, didn't you work with Karen? Karen Cooper. I point over there because she lives across the street, but she's an ecologist, friend of mine, and an expert in citizen science. So you were doing some citizen science stuff with her. And now you have this postdoc at the museum under Lindsay Zano, who I was going to say she's one of my favorite paleontologists, but I might as well say it. I guess she's my favorite paleontologist because I mean, I didn't previously have them ranked. And I know her and love her, and she's great. She's made, a lot of scientists often find things and get to name them, and she's found some great, vicious, big theropods that had not been, uh, uh, identified by
Hmm.
scientists yet. And so she's there in the paleontology lab at the museum. And tell me a little bit about your job there, because they've been teasing us with a huge new exhibit that right now there's construction at the museum to prayer. It's still a year off probably, but what is
Hmm.
tell me about the Dueling Dinosaur exhibit. What is it?
It's right. So yeah, you're right to say to rate rank Lindsay as up there. She's a pretty phenomenal person and scientist. But so
You know what?
what is
You know
going?
what's a funny
Yeah.
little anecdote about that? You
What?
might know this, but I mean, I do know that you know that she's married to a paleontologist. And when the job was coming up in 2012, probably 2011, at the museum, both of them applied for the position to be director of the paleontology lab. And Lindsay got it, and Bucky did not. But he wasn't surprised. I think that he ranks her above him as a paleontologist. But in that interest, the husband and wife, they both applied for the job.
Yeah.
She got the good job, and he was able to find other work not being the director of the lab. So,
Yeah.
yeah, they're both great. They're my favorite
Yeah.
paleontologist couple.
Oh
So
yeah.
sorry about that.
Totally.
And this
No,
amazing.
that's
So
so.
she's overseeing this amazing new exhibit that's gonna appear at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh, but it's still about a year off. So what is the Dueling Dinosaur exhibit?
Right. So the paleontology lab has acquired the dueling dinosaurs, which are like one of a kind specimen that was found out west here in the United States, and it's a Triceratops and a T Rex, as they describe it, locked in battle. And also, they are incredibly well preserved. It's a completely, fully articulated skeletons, and there's really nothing like it. But the museum has acquired it, and as part of this Dueling Dinosaurs program or experience, they're building a new dinosaur lab that'll be on the first floor of the Nature Research Center at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And they're actually drilling their jackhammers right now, so I can hear that in the background. But it's supposed to open next year, and some of my colleagues here in the lab are going to be the ones prepping the dueling dinosaurs right there on the first floor of the museum. And so members of the public can watch them as they take that out of the jackets and out of the dirt that came from out west. So you can actually watch, or like, I mean, it's incredible when you think about it. You can watch one of the most amazing specimens that's ever been found be further excavated and then prepared for study and for display. So
Is
that's
the
coming up in
actual
about a
are the
year.
actual fossils going to be displayed?
Oh yeah. Oh
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 yeah.
oh. Actually, after they're prepped, I'm not
Or is
sure
it do they
about
make
the plans.
replicas? Yeah, I'm not sure about that either.
I'm not sure,
Um,
but that's a good question. Yeah.
let me just throw this in there, and I'll take this one. Uh, Fred asked, "Do you think lizards and mammals share a common ancestor?" Yes, they do, because all creatures share a common ancestor if you go back far enough. But I think he's asking, like how close. But of course they do. I mean, it's all just a matter of gradation and how
Yeah.
distant. We share a common ancestor with chimps. We share a common ancestor with all mammals. We share a common ancestor with trees, let alone lizards. So that was an easy one. So I took that one myself. Um,
Thanks.
yeah, sure. So, well, that's really exciting. And now, one of your job there at the museum, relating is about a citizen science project uh, involving the Dueling Dinosaur exhibit. What is Cretaceous Creatures?
Right. So let's citizen science is basically an approach to doing science that involves members of the public. Um, So if you want to participate in science, there are opportunities for you to do so in all areas of science. But here, as part of the Dueling Dinosaurs, we have hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sediment, which is a fancy word for dirt, that was excavated out in Montana. We've brought it back here to the museum. And this dirt is about 66 to 67 million years old. What we're doing here at our lab is we're creating kits with magnifying lenses and other tools, and packaging the dirt to send it out to 8th grade science teachers across North Carolina, and then eventually across the United States, and then eventually internationally. And when these kits get to the schools, the teachers will be helping the students to search through their bag of dirt to look for microfossils. And microfossils are just as they sound. They're microscopic. They're really, really tiny. And they're small bones and teeth and shells and scales. And the students are going to be finding fossils that no one has seen before, and then trying to identify them through an online program, and then sending all of that data back to us at the museum, and we're going to study it. So they're creating an original scientific database. So it's called Cretaceous Creatures because they're finding little creatures from the Cretaceous.
Nice. And, I'm a big fan of, thanks to my relationships with Karen Cooper and a colleague of hers, Darlene Cavalier, I've been aware of and interested in citizen science for a long time. So we'll hear about other citizen science projects on But Seriously. But what a cool one where kids can actually have the experience of sifting through and searching for fossils, and it's real. It's not just a game, which you can do at some museums and science centers, I think sometimes. It's really real, and the data will go back to scientists. So you're really contributing to science. That's awesome. So
Exactly.
let's talk about the book. Hey, Fred. Fred, you're asking some really technical questions, and I just want to remind you that our guest today is a historian. So some of the very technical questions that you want to ask about humanized mice with knockout genes and stuff, it sounds very interesting, but not for this show. Fred. Let's talk history, and let's talk about Jurassic Park and the people that are trying to make it real. I mean, I don't know. It's like, let's just jump right in. How close are we to realizing Jurassic Park?
Okay, so spoiler alert, we don't have any dinosaur DNA. It is unlikely that we will. But what is so fascinating about the history of ancient DNA research, which is ancient DNA research, real quick, is the practice of extracting and sequencing DNA from really old organisms. So roughly they could be anywhere from 100 years old to, the upper limit is about 1 million years old right now. So it's really it's an art and a science trying to extract DNA from old organisms, because that DNA is so degraded. And then also when it's degraded, it's easily contaminated by researchers handling it in the lab, or if it's been exposed to other environmental resources, like throughout the time from when it was buried and to when it's been found. So what we see, though, is that when scientists are trying to extract DNA from all different types of organisms, so plants, animals, humans, even ancient diseases, what we find is that you don't know unless you try. So we don't know if we can get dinosaur DNA until we try. And in the 1990s, that's exactly what happened. We had scientists trying to extract DNA, not just from insects and amber, but from actual dinosaur bone. And we find again and again that the DNA either isn't there, or if some of the scientists thought it was there, it was later proven to be a contaminant from a human, someone working in the research lab. That was embarrassing, but again, you don't know until you try. Or either you just can't reproduce results. So, um,
I like the idea that
my
they would maybe
caveat,
they're trying to get DNA from a fossil and they get some DNA and then they raise it and you go, wow, that dinosaur sure looks like you, Brian.
that's exactly right. And that's what was like the 1990s. The reason why there was all this hype around dinosaur DNA is because that's when Jurassic Park came out as a movie, not just a book, but as a blockbuster phenomenon. Um, and so you have the whole decade of this search for the most ancient DNA and a race for it among scientists too.
Yeah. Let me ask you something. So, does this idea for a lot of us non-scientists when Jurassic Park came out, that was the first I'd ever heard of this idea and it was so fascinating. Oh, wow. But you got to figure, Michael Crichton was a writer. He had an MD and a PhD, but he wasn't a scientist and he certainly wasn't a researcher. So, this idea I mean, I don't know how many people ever thought past it, but what a remarkable idea, the possibility of obtaining DNA from blood inside a mosquito, inside amber. But is that idea original to Michael Crichton, or had it been bounced around? Had scientists talk about it? And I'm going to just cut to this and ask you what this is about.
Yeah, so this is the cover of the very first Ancient DNA newsletter. And this was a really intimate kind of newsletter amongst maybe anywhere from 20 to 50 scientists. The first issue, I think, was in 1990. I should know that. But it was just circulated among a select few researchers who were exploring this idea of like, what can we get DNA from? And reliably, and then how can we use it not necessarily to bring back extinct creatures, but to learn more about their evolutionary history, how they lived, and then perhaps what contributed to their death or their extinction, and how we might prevent those kinds of things in the future. But this idea of extracting DNA from fossils is actually not original to Michael Crichton. He got the idea from some research that had been going on in the early 1980s. And what's really interesting about this is when I was trying to do the intellectual history of where did this idea come from, I was reading Jurassic Park, like any good historian should, and I was looking at the acknowledgments. And in the first paperback issue of Jurassic Park, there's a scientist who's credited, George Poinar, and the Extinct DNA Study Group as the influence or inspiration behind Jurassic Park. Then I was reading the acknowledgments on a separate paperback of Jurassic Park, and I saw a different name. So I saw George Poinar and the Extinct DNA Study Group, but I also saw the name Charles Pellegrino. And so I did some more research on Charles Pellegrino, and actually in 1985, he published the Jurassic Park kind of recipe, as people were calling it, or the Jurassic Park hypothesis. He published that in Omni, which is a now defunct science fiction magazine.
I grew up with
extremely
Omni.
popular.
It was science and
Yeah.
science fiction. Yeah, great stuff. And when you say the recipe, was he specifically saying insect trapped in amber?
Yes, yeah, yeah. So he had gone out with one of his entomologist friends, and I think it was in New Jersey, and they found a really interesting site with a lot of amber preserved specimens. And Charles Pellegrino does a little bit of everything. He's a writer, he does paleontology, he studies space rockets. He's gone on excavations in Pompeii and the Titanic. He's an extremely interesting person, but he's also an extremely controversial figure. And he speculates and he thinks a lot, and he's a creative. And he created this idea and wrote about it. It took him forever to get it published because Smithsonian Magazine said it was too speculative. He tried and he tried and he tried, but he got it published in Omni, which is science fiction. But that's really where this idea, this Jurassic Park hypothesis of extracting DNA from insects that were preserved in amber, and then maybe if those insects had fed on dinosaurs at the time, maybe we could use that DNA to bring back dinosaurs. That's really where it began. And Michael Crichton uh, had that idea and then further developed it.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. Let's talk about the book and how it's your first book. Um, so you got inspired because you just happened to work with Mary and then find that she was doing this really interesting. So tell me a little, take me towards the book, like how that led to you going, oh, I think I could write a book about this. And then what that was like.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's another funny thing to talk about. So I also never wanted to write a book. I distinctly remember uh, sitting in my, I think it was a sophomore seminar history, and learning about the book writing process. And I remember thinking how horrible it sounded to write a book. And I remember
What do you
thinking
remember? Do you remember what sounded horrible to you?
the idea of having so much, the idea of having something to say that was unique, that you could, and enough of it, enough of something good to say, and to put it in a book, that was what was daunting to me. You know, how could someone have so much material that someone else would want to read about and then put it together
Yeah.
in a way, and then someone put it in print? That just sounded, made my stomach turn, and it still kind of does. So, but you know, the thing was, is that um, what I did to write the book is I went around and interviewed the scientists who do this work. So I'm a historian, but actually I'm a historian of modern science. So that means I get to talk to the scientists who do this stuff because they're still alive, which is great, but also not great because if they don't like what I write, you know, they can talk to me about it. Um, but I traveled across Europe and the U.S. and Canada, and there are researchers in the global South and elsewhere that have been doing some good ancient DNA research that will be interviewees in the future. But I took all of these experiences, firsthand accounts, exclusive interviews with the scientists who were the very first people to either extract DNA from mummies, from dinosaur bones, from insects and ambers, from Neanderthals, all of it, and use their stories to write this book. With my, of course, my historian of science lens on it. But that's how the book came to be, really. And even though I didn't want to write it, this material is too good not to write.
And in the end, how was your writing experience? And do you think you'll do it again?
Yeah. Well, okay. So another fun thing is, well, I wrote the book uh, and revised it through 2 pregnancies and 2 births. So I would not recommend doing that. But also, if that's your only opportunity to do it, you have to do it. It was that made it extremely difficult. But also in a way, I think this book is going to be that much better for it. But yes, I'll do it again, but I'll do it maybe in 10 years.
Well, yeah, you say that now, but you also said you never wanted to write a book in the first place. So we'll see about that.
That's right. Follow
Um,
up.
yeah, it may not be 10 years. So, that's an interesting point you made about historians because I used to ask Paul Brinkman, historian of science, focused on the early days of paleontology. His research is focused on 19th century paleontology. And so he can't interview anyone. He has to go to their notebooks and go to original sources. He has to sift through all that kind of stuff to paint a picture of that period of history. But you're a historian. Was there a time that one minute you're studying history and then you realized, well, I could study what's happening now at this moment in history for future historians and people?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, it gets messy kind of in the area that I'm working because the book starts in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And so that's not really history for a lot of people. Um, but I'm collecting their memories while they're here, and collecting an archive as well as like unpublished documents, letters that they have, early conference and newsletters, and grant applications. So collecting an archive now for other people to make use of later. But yeah, a lot of the research does get up to, the book goes up until about 2013, 2015. With a lot of the new de-extinction efforts, and we can talk more about that later.
Yes.
But yeah, when you get in that area, you're not really writing history. There's a little bit of an identity crisis between, that historian and sociologist expertise that I have, but then am I a journalist? Which I'm not. I can't do fast writing like that. Um, but yeah, so that's about where it starts and stops.
Do you identify, if not as a journalist, as a documentarian?
I like
You're
that.
documenting this
I like that.
period of history, and so you're aware that, like, this is stuff that future historians might want to know about, and so you're capturing stuff in a form that in the future people could look at.
Yeah, hopefully.
But that's not really your motivation, really. Like,
No.
what gets you? History was always, I know a lot of people think math and science are hard or boring or something, and I always gravitated towards science and math, and I was good at it, and it made sense, and you could figure things out. Whereas history just seemed like a sea of unrelated facts that are in some random order that you have to memorize for a test. I don't want historians to hate me, but that's what history felt like to me compared to math and science, that all the pieces that you could reconstruct, that you can figure things out. So what motivates you? What do you like about this work? What gets you up in the morning when you have kids and a husband and a job and all this? What motivates you to get up and do your work?
Oh, well, I mean, coffee for sure. That's the first thing I'm always thinking about. But after that, yeah, and historians shouldn't be mad at you if that's your perception. Really, that's the way I think it's been taught, unfortunately. But like, I have the exact opposite experience. I think because of my teachers who taught history in a different way, is that yes, things did happen, but how you tell it is critical to what you think happened. So you can write, like, someone else could take my material and rewrite this book. And there are some other books out there on ancient DNA, not from this angle, but the teller of the story has their own perspective, and the people who tell the stories and what gets preserved in the historical record is very selective. It's not objective. And what's fascinating to me is that anyone can look at whatever body of evidence, and in my case, that's letters, publications, movies, articles, anything like that, and also interviews with the scientist, and tell a story that's never been told before. And it's not like you're making it up, but you're actually getting at a more robust picture of what happened. So my thing is, what I love about history is that there's never just one story to tell. There are multiple stories, and the more stories we have out there, the better. What I love about it is that, yeah, it's not completely finite like math, because yeah, if it was, I wouldn't be doing that.
Well, it's interesting. Most people, as soon as you bring up this subject about de-extinction and should we bring extinct animals back, and you immediately think Jurassic Park and you immediately think dinosaurs. But not only are dinosaurs like the least likely because they're so old, they're just not the only story here. So people should know it. Like, I want to hear about some of the other stories about what's going on. It's not all about de-extinction of dinosaurs. There are things that are more recent extinctions, like the carrier pigeon or the woolly mammoth. Or, why don't I just ask you about what is this?
This is the quagga.
This isn't
Um,
just something that was prepared for an episode of Star Trek. It's just a horse with a funny paint job.
that's hilarious. Yeah, it's a horse-like animal with a funny paint job for sure. So this is the quagga, and it went extinct in the late 1800s. Um, it was actually kind of pushed out of its habitat in sub-Saharan Africa and hunted to extinction, which is the story of many other species. And this was actually the very first specimen that DNA was extracted from, and scientists published about it in the journal Nature in 1984. So this image is iconic because it was a landmark publication where what it did is it said to other scientists and the public more generally is like, actually, we can extract DNA from ancient organisms. In this case, it's not a fossil. What they extracted DNA from was tissue, and really old tissue. And they only got, several hundred sequences of DNA. So, really not a lot to do much of anything with it other than to do a phylogenetic tree, which is to figure out how this creature, which is incredibly unusual looking, was related to other horses, modern and also ancient.
I just picture this quagga like entering a room, peering in, and you go, "You think I'm a zebra?" But then strolls in and goes, "But I'm not." And if he comes in from the back, you just think it's a horse, and then you're like, "What happened to your head, buddy?"
Yeah.
Yeah, I never heard of this creature.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah, it's a favorite. It's a fan favorite. But what's so cool about the quagga as well is that this is where people usually start the history of ancient DNA research. But in my book, it actually starts 10 years before that because scientists were trying to extract DNA from insects in amber and also mammoth because they had some great samples of mammoth tissue and muscle that was found frozen in Russia. And so there's really a whole backstory to how this study even got to be, even though people usually say this is the first time. But so that's what I mean by there's not just one story to tell. You can always uncover other leads to a big moment in history.
Yeah. Elizabeth Hayes says hello, and hello out there, Elizabeth.
Hey.
And so is Colossal the name of the company that's trying to de-extinct the mammoth?
The one that I'm familiar with is Revive and Restore through the Long Now Foundation. It's a conservation biology organization. They're working on they are working on like the passenger pigeon and the woolly mammoth. And I'm not super up to date though on if they are if maybe Colossal is part of someone else's program because there are multiple efforts, including like George Church at Harvard.
I'm curious about that because I've crossed paths with George Church. He's one of the many people that. How many people did you interview for this book? Over those. And how long?
Over 50.
Over 50 people over what period of time were you working on this?
About 4 years.
And a time period that covered 2 of your 3 pregnancies? Is that?
Oh, the interviews were prior to that.
Oh, interviews are even prior.
Thankfully.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, then it was getting down to the writing process. That's okay. So,
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You're back. So tell me something about the mammoth. Like, what do you know about efforts? Because I've been hearing about that one for years. and it's like, oh, it's not that different from an elephant, and it's only been extinct for 10,000 or tens of thousands of years. Am I in the right ballpark there?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's good.
So there are efforts
Yes.
to bring back. Yeah, tell me something interesting you learned there. Again, not a scientist, but as a historian, what are some interesting people you talked to, or something interesting you learned?
Yeah. So, um, a lot of a lot of the book is about that influence of Jurassic Park on the shaping of people's interest into ancient DNA research, either as consumers of it or producers of it, like scientists getting interested in it, and trying to pursue it. But it really, you see this transition as we find out that we can't get DNA. And at least not yet, we can't get DNA from dinosaurs. You see this transition from this Jurassic Park idea to actually something that is now being called Pleistocene Park. And that's a real place in Siberia. I don't know, have you heard of it?
No, Pleistocene Park.
Yeah. So there are a couple of Russian scientists who have created a reserve in Siberia. And their goal there is to, not just recreate the woolly mammoth to put it there, but they're trying to recreate the ecosystem. So the tundra, the grasslands that used to be there. And they've shown that actually when it's a big picture. So you just don't need the vegetation. You need the animals that were a part of that ecosystem in order to create it and maintain it. So it's this bigger idea called rewilding. So it's like bringing back what used to be, and not just bringing back an extinct creatures just to have it, but as part of this bigger ecosystem. So the woolly mammoth is would be the star of the show of this Pleistocene Park. And this seemed kind of like a far fetched idea, but in 2013, Revive and Restore and National Geographic and TED held this big conference in DC and brought some, George Church and then Beth Shapiro and Hendrik Poinar, who are really respectable to their peers, researchers, geneticists, ancient DNA researchers, that really brought a lot of credibility to this idea that, it's not going to be like Jurassic Park, but it's going to be something a little similar, just with mammoths and Pleistocene Park. And with this bigger view it's kind of like conservation biology with a twist.
Yeah, let me ask you, as a is your do you in the book or in your life as a historian, do you try to remain agnostic and impartial about this, or do you, like the question everyone asks, like, should we do this? Do you take a side? Do you take a position, or are you just reporting what these people are doing? Do you inject, your fears or hopes or opinions
Mm-hmm.
into the narrative?
Uh, no, I do not. I play it safe, but what I do is I do include all of my interviewees' reservations or fears or optimistic views of de-extinction. Because the reason why de-extinction is a part of this book is because not because ancient DNA researchers are the ones who are really trying to bring back extinct creatures. Some of them may be involved in some of those efforts, but it's really not what they do. They're using DNA to study evolutionary history, and to find out how species are related, and using that DNA to do it. But the reason why de-extinction plays such a big role in the book is because I was asking these researchers, like, why do you always get asked this question? Can we bring back dinosaurs, or can we bring back mammoths? Can we bring back Neanderthals? And one of the interviewees actually called it the Jurassic Park effect. It's because ancient DNA research is just but one way um, to bring back an extinct creature. And it was the most popularized way through Jurassic Park, specifically the movie, where people could wrap their head around a pretty crazy idea. And so what you see throughout this 40-year history of ancient DNA research is that this idea of extracting DNA from fossils, but also using that DNA to bring back extinct creatures is like inextricably linked. They're, you know, and they're not actually, it's not actually what the researchers are trying to do.
Yeah, so
Um,
what you're saying is they're not trying to de-extinct them in order to create Jurassic Park or even
right.
Pleistocene Park. So what is there? So it's really that it's a method of studying. They don't necessarily want to bring back a population of T-Rex. They just want to better understand. But is it that they're better understand evolutionary history by bringing back a group of T-Rex? Or the woolly mammoth. I mean, does somebody want to bring back a bunch of mammoths, or they just want to understand? Yeah, that's interesting what their motivation is.
Yeah. And that's
why
what
would it be worth investing in? Like, these are expensive efforts, the research, or if it's a business venture, what makes it worthwhile? Because it does seem like you said, ecology, the interconnections are infinite. Like, you can't. So what if you bring back a mammoth and 4 species of plant? That's not really bringing back the whole environment. I don't know. All of
yeah,
a sudden,
exactly.
I'm having all these new thoughts
No,
about it.
no,
Yeah.
that's right. And the when I was asking these scientists these questions, it was incredible because we went from the realm of, I mean, and it's me as a historian. It's like, science is not does not exist outside of ethics. It does not exist outside of society. So, but we had all these incredible conversations about the philosophical implications, the ethical, the financial, the moral. And some people, there's a huge range amongst ancient DNA researchers. Some of them are extremely opposed to de-extinction because they think it is not moral to bring back an extinct creature. They're very concerned about like what's the motivation behind it. They're also really concerned because they think it's a lot of spectacle and there's not much science behind it, it's and that it's not genuine. But then also like the philosophical questions, like, so would it just be a hairy elephant, or what, but there's so many different ways to go about resurrecting an extinct creature in some form or fashion. It's extremely technical. It's pretty complicated. But what's fascinating and what the book details is just the scientists who are often considered the people who want to bring back dinosaurs are the people who do not want to bring back dinosaurs. So it covers all of that and why that is.
Yeah, maybe let me ask you about those extremes. Like, is there like, I'd like to ask you about some of the characters you met that you found fascinating. And one way I feel like I could ask you is there a scientist that somebody sneezed? Is there a scientist that are they allergic to some ancient DNA that's now filtering through the lab?
We don't have any of that here.
Is there a scientist who is like a very prominent proponent of this research? And on the other hand, maybe there's a scientist that you interviewed that is a serious critic and doesn't support it at all. I feel like there could be people in between, but do you have any characters, any people you could tell us about that, and about what you learned from them about their reasons? I know you just sort of touched on this, but
Yeah. So let's see. I can go through two. So another thing is that my interviewees are anonymized because these are scientists that are alive and well and working today. And I conducted all the interviews under the condition of anonymity.
So they could talk badly about their peers.
That's right. Yes.
Honestly, the word I meant was honestly.
Honestly, and that's exactly what they did.
Okay.
So a lot of the let's see, one of the interviewees called me like a therapist for scientists. Because when I'd leave the interview, they think, "Wow, I'd never thought about that," or "Oh, there's all this trauma from my scientific experience," and it's an insanely competitive and opinionated group of researchers. Um, you find these types of personalities in other high profile areas of research, which is a feature of what I call a celebrity science, but people who are ambitious, um, enthusiastic, enjoy the media spotlight, and are really good at communicating with the public because of that. It's a real gift in a lot of ways. Um, so a lot of the people I interviewed are just really extreme characters. They're fascinating individuals. Um, but on one extreme, um, you have some one interviewee is extremely hostile to this idea of de-extinction. Um, and most of the quotes are just, cuss word after cuss word about, this, because the problem that this researcher had was that it was spectacle and it wasn't science, and it took away the credibility from the field to be saying you're going to do something that seemed too showy. And that's an interesting tension that the whole book explores, is like, as a celebrity science, how do you make yourself available to the public and interesting to the public, but at the same time maintain your stoic position as a scientist and your credibility and legitimacy. And that is what's so fascinating about this field, is that it's a push and pull between those two really real needs to be credible and legitimate. And they don't
Calling
just,
it a
have.
celebrity science, is that, I mean, you didn't make up that term. That's a term you came across. It was being referred to as like a celebrity
Oh,
science,
actually,
or
I did come up with that term.
oh,
It's
really?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, the
So
first time you hear it,
is
it's
that
right here.
derogatory? Is that saying like it's just
Yeah.
merely a celebrity? It's like, because you're saying that, like, there is this, how much of it is
Yeah.
real science and how much of it
Mm,
is, um, kind of a romanticized
sure.
celebrity science.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that. So this is somewhere where I do interject my opinion as a historian of science. So celebrity science, hear me loud and clear, I view as a positive phenomenon, because what we're seeing is that scientists operating in today's world have to be aware of the media and celebrity culture, because science is not separate from any of those things. And it's it's really fascinating because as a celebrity science, you see the tensions of how science really works. And I'm suggesting celebrity science as ancient DNA research is just one case study of it. So you can look at other fields, probably like forensic science or astronomy or paleontology more broadly, and see this interplay between publication timings and the release of Jurassic Park, and grant funding associated with the popularity of certain scientific topics. These things really have, are really linked together, and then the book details that. And what happens with a celebrity science is that it's not like one person gets the attention. It's the subject of science that gets the attention. And it just doesn't happen at one point in history. It happens repeatedly and over a long period of time. And really, in my view, it's it's a it's a phenomenon of our modern world and how modern science operates in it. So I think there's definitely the researchers that I interview, there's definitely negatives to being a science in the spotlight, and they voice those throughout their history and throughout this book. But just because there are negative consequences doesn't mean it's an overall negative experience or a negative phenomenon to be a celebrity science. So
Okay.
it's not, to me, it is not derogatory. I think that if you take a derogatory view of it, I think you're missing a lot of the nuance. And you're also um, missing a lot of what the real world is.
Did it? You know what? Oh, yeah, I can say. I guess this is going along with that sneeze earlier, Tim. And I'm not sure about the context here. Fred said in 2020, the number of all chickens in the U.S. totaled around 518 million. Maybe Fred is saying there are already enough dinosaurs here, because as we know, birds are dinosaurs.
I that's probably what he's saying.
There's plenty of dinosaurs. Um, did did anyone express? One of the critics express a specific fear, like of a consequence, um, of here's why we can't do this because of this very real, some scientific
Mm.
possibility.
Yeah. Well, one of them was that, um, oh, a number of researchers felt this way, that it'd be more advisable to put those resources and that energy towards conserving currently endangered species instead of bringing back the ones that that's a common criticism. However, I do want to note that the Revive and Restore which is a probably one of the biggest um, spokesperson organization, whatever, for de-extinction, is committed to doing work towards endangered species as well as extinct species. So it's not an either or. Um,
Right.
Another real fear that's very science fictiony, but also probably reality, is when you're reviving or with ancient DNA or reviving anything in general. What about ancient diseases? Or I think there have been some books, science fiction books out there. Should probably be a little bit more well read, that area, but um, those are some of the real reservations. I say focus on the current species. Yeah,
Tim
there are
agrees.
some
Yeah.
people doing that. Yeah.
But there is always that idea, like people attack the space program sometimes. I go, we should focus on it. But
That's exactly
what
right.
are you doing in your career? Are you focused on the problems on Earth? Let some people focus on the space
Hmm.
program, and some people focus on some of these ideas of DXT. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I'll remain agnostic because I don't know enough except to have some gut reaction, some emotional reaction that
Hmm.
it's either super cool or no, it's dangerous. I don't really know enough about the
Hmm.
science to have much to voice a stronger opinion on either side.
Yeah,
And
I hear you on
and do
that.
you know? But you've studied now. Again, you're a historian, not a scientist, and you remain agnostic in the book. But do you have any personal feelings after everything you've been exposed to?
Well, let's see. I would say, yeah, I think when you learn more about the possibilities as well as the limitations, it's it becomes more of like something, not like a why not would you do it, but I mean, this is how we figure things out. um, and sometimes it's not about just bringing back an extinct creature, but it's refining or testing and refining the technologies that can get us there. And when you look at this in the rewilding context and the conservation biology perspective, it's really appealing. And it's a lot more complicated, and it's not this superficial, let's just bring it back to bring it back. It's really a lot more nuance than that. And I would completely, since I am not the scientist, I'd completely point people to one of my interviewees, actually, Beth Shapiro. And she's written a popular science book, How to Clone a Mammoth. Um, and really, spoiler alert, it's not about like how to clone a mammoth, but it's all the reasons why this is so hard, but also what we can do. And
And did you tell me she's both a scientist and the author of that book?
correct, yes. And she works really closely with other researchers in this area, and she's a perfect middle ground between all of the interviewees, that about the extreme opponents and the extreme proponents. She has a very balanced view. So yeah, I'll put a plug for her anytime, as far as if someone wants to know more about this. the technical aspects, but written or explained in an accessible way, she's the go-to for that. And
Excellent.
so, yeah, my view is I'm on board with it with some
Okay.
reservations.
Um, Tim said, correct, without space program, we would not have the breakfast drink Tang. So, right, another important thing. Many other spin offs besides
I
Tang.
didn't know that.
But Tim asks, I'm late to the presentation. Did you mention if any scientists had religious objections to this idea?
Oh, that's a great question. No one said anything specifically like because of my religious views this, but a there were a lot of the ethical and moral dimension that people felt really strongly about. Um, it all had to go back to this, like, why are you doing it? Are you doing it to make money? Are you doing it to put it on display? Are you doing it just for fun? Are you doing it for media attention? All of those things were no-goes for a lot of scientists. So that's as close as we get to, I think, a religious, you know,
Yeah.
a religious objection. Great question, though.
Yeah. Let's see. There were some other comments from Fred about perhaps computers can estimate or deduct the missing prehistoric DNA. I mean, I think that's part of
Mm.
the situation. Like they recover what they can, and then um, they try to fill in the pieces with creatures with similar creatures that are still alive, like an elephant for the mammoth or
Mm-hmm.
something with the chicken. You look like you were about to say something.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, one of the a classic illustration that the scientists use to explain what they do when they're working with ancient DNA. It's like, um, so think about a book as a whole genome, and then imagine all the pages torn out, and then like you know soaked in water and then shredded, and then you have to read the book. That's kind of like what it's like working with ancient DNA because you only you only get a little bit and it's also not very clear and you have to do a lot of work uh, reconstructing what that genome looked like. So for a lot of organisms we have sequences, but of course not the full genome.
Yeah. Tim says, I'm amazed no religious concern. Remember, the world was created 30,000 years ago. 30, you're being generous. Isn't it?
I
Some
was about
people
to
think
say that's nice.
7,000. And yeah. Elizabeth, was there any in the process of researching and writing this book? Was there a worst thing that happened, a worse experience? It doesn't have to be about anyone, and you can tell it without naming names, unless you want to name names. But or just something that was, I don't know. I don't know. Do you have any answer to that? Was there something that was like, well, the hardest thing, or the most miserable thing, or one terrible thing that happened? Just one.
Yeah. Well, so I guess I'm just embarrassing myself on this whole podcast from Michael Bolton to like, yeah, whatever. Um, yeah, so it doesn't take a lot for me to cry. Um, and one of my interviewees almost made me cry because this particular interviewee was really just really dismissive of what I was doing with the project and as a researcher, and just ended up, I felt interrogated with a lot of, I felt like I was getting questioned about my questions.
Yeah.
And it was, it was pretty tough. And at about 45 minutes, I think I wanted to, to give up. But then I hung on for 5 more minutes and it went, it, it turned around. So I guess I passed the test. But
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was pretty rough. So yeah, aside from almost breaking down, crying in an interview, that was pretty tough. But I think what that shows you too is that, I mean, it's a high profile field. I mean, it's a celebrity science, and a lot of these researchers are, um, they're amazing people, but there's a lot of difficult personalities too, and that's detailed throughout the history, not from my perspective, but from their colleagues' perspectives and their students' perspectives. And there's a whole divide in the community. The believers and the non-believers of certain research, as they called them, they ended up separating into different conferences, different places of publications. There was a lot of negating of people's work by either just ignoring it, not citing it, not having their students read it, not attending certain conferences because other people were going to be there. It's fascinating. So, and that's not unique to ancient DNA. Look at archaeology or anthropology. There's a lot of tension there too. But yeah.
And on the other hand, were there any just really when you think back, some of your favorite things that happened or something amazing that happened, something that was really positive and maybe even surprising?
Yeah. I think overall, as far as this method of collecting oral history interviews, because I was a historian, scientists were really receptive to having me come to their labs and meet their students, their colleagues, to see some amazing specimens, and to go to dinner with them and have drinks. And I think what was that was incredible, because you really got to know the people behind the science. So yeah, some of my favorite experiences are actually probably just going out and getting drinks with the scientist. But then you had to be pretty discerning about, I mean, that was off the record, but really discerning about what parts, what things you heard were drama, what things were scandal that you just could not write about, and then what was okay for me to write about.
Oh, so there was stuff that you didn't get to write about.
Yeah,
Something
that's right.
scandalous
That's right.
that you could share with us. No?
Nope. Lips are sealed.
The tight-lipped historian of science.
Off the record. I'm professional.
Yeah. And you went out, like what you did, you went out and like you did some field work in the course of this? Like you joined some people on their field work? Or you visited labs?
Yeah, I visited labs. So, okay, well, yeah, let's see. So field work, 10 years ago, a long time ago, I was digging up dinosaurs with Mary Schweitzer out in Montana.
Before the book, but part of your path.
Yeah, right. And I found a really, really tiny rib from Albertosaurus, which is related to T-Rex.
That's cool.
So really, yeah, super cool, but an insignificant.
Was it exciting to see it? Like, did you see it at the surface? Like a little hint of it? And then you're like, I think I found something.
Yeah. And it took me 2 weeks of just, basically I was just digging in a hole of dirt for 2 weeks and then found like a little bit of something. And, I think, the other scientists out there acted like it was really cool, but it's probably pretty insignificant. So they were making me feel better. But I did do some ancient DNA lab work when I was in London. We actually, if you've heard of him, Jeremy Bentham, he is a long dead philosopher, but he proposed the utilitarian philosophy, which is the greatest good for the greatest number of people sort of thing. This should be the general decision you make for whatever it is. And he, for whatever reason, wanted his body preserved and upon his death. And so that's exactly what happened. His whole skeleton in his actual clothes from the late 1700s is preserved and on display at University College London.
I mean, we display all these other species. Why not, right? But he's in his clothes. Right. The others aren't in clothes.
That's right. Maybe we should put the other animals in clothes.
Isn't that weird? Yeah. Like, we could have all of these species displayed. Every one of them is naked. But if you put a human naked, all of a sudden we go, oh, that's pornography. It's like, why are we so different from the others? When you talk about what Bentham says, like, I know that philosophy. I learned it from Spock. That the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. I know it from Star Trek. Does that sum up? That's the phrasing I
Yes.
remember from Star Trek,
Yep.
but that sums
All right.
up
There you go.
and you studied philosophy and history.
Yeah. So Star Trek and Jeremy Bentham, one and the same. But yeah,
And
where I
Tim
was
says
going with
that, just correcting what he said, that according to some religions, the Bible states 5,500. I don't think the Bible states it. I think people have interpreted some stuff in the Bible to maybe mean that. But I don't think,
That's
because,
right.
I mean, how could it say that? Like, I don't think it states a
No.
date for the beginning. But then he also says, another tease, not a question, was one of the scientists, Rosanna, she was concerned about extinct species. That might be a little before your time. That's a Gilda
I don't
Radner
know.
joke from the earliest era of Saturday Night Live. And she would often
Oh,
mistake words like that. Like, what's all this about extinct feces? And then they'd go, species. Oh, never mind. That was the brilliant Gilda Radner. So, what would you like people to? Of course, your book comes out. Your book comes out tomorrow. It's Ancient DNA: The Making of a Celebrity Science by Elizabeth Jones. You can already pre-order it. It's available, but it is officially out tomorrow. And what do you want people to know? What do you want us to take away? Like, what's your sort of takeaway from the experience, and what you might say to intrigue a prospective buyer of your book?
oh. Well, gosh, what I want people to take away from this is that it's just like what I do is I go behind the scenes of science, and in this case behind the scenes of celebrity too. And I want people to come along with me, because science doesn't, oftentimes it happens and we can't see how it happens. What this book does is it gives you those exclusive interviews with people who are doing groundbreaking research, and it takes you through all the ups and downs and the hype and the step back that these scientists experienced. And what I want people to take from it is that when they finish reading it, they'll have a better sense of how a new scientific field comes to be. So, ancient DNA research didn't, come out of nowhere, but it was just an idea of science fiction, and scientists had to do the hard work of making it into more of a reality. And that's what the whole book is about. And it is, to me, it is so cool to be able to go behind the scenes and see how that happens. And so it's kind of like looking into a research lab, except you got to read it. So that's my sell for the book.
Yeah, that's excellent. So science, that's interesting. I've often liked to tell people, I'm not like you. I'm not a scientist. You've kind of worked closer and more in, but in my own way, I've been working with scientists and in the science world for years. But I've often said that music is not just for musicians, art is not just for artists, and science is not just for scientists. Do you have anything
That's
to say
nice.
about the importance of scientists? So you approach it. You're a historian of science. So
That's right.
what's your pitch for science to the non-scientist?
Huh. My
Sorry to
pitch
put
is
you on the
that,
spot.
yeah, no, that's right. Scientists are people too. May seem silly to say, but scientists are people. And as one of my interviewees said, actually one of the most influential interviews in the entire field, controversial ones, but science is a social process, and we should not think of it as anything but that. And so science is done by people, it's done for people, and the closer we feel to it, the better.
Excellent. Regina says she loves your Twitter handle. which
Thank you.
yeah, show you it's both Twitter and Instagram. Dr. Dino DNA, at Dr. Dino DNA. You can find her on Twitter and Instagram. And I also should say that she works over there with my good friends over at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, which is always one of the top tourist attractions in the state of North Carolina.
Yep.
And it's an awesome museum. Right now, in one building, one whole first floor is under construction as they make way for the Dueling Dinos exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
And Elizabeth is over coordinating the citizen science project that goes with that. If you missed the beginning of the show, that's the Cretaceous Creatures
That's right.
project that a lot of students will get to participate in and be citizen scientists. You know what? Maybe I'll take this one too. Fred said, do you think Elon Musk is a scientist? I don't know if you have a thought on that, but in one way, I want to play both sides of it and say that we can all be scientists and citizen scientists to some degree. I think he's more of an engineer. I don't really know his background, but maybe he's more of an engineer. But I wouldn't say he isn't in the same way that even without a degree, you can be a scientist. I've heard a lot of scientists express this, that we should encourage people and that you don't have to have a PhD or even a master's to be a scientist. Yeah, do you have anything to add to that? Yeah.
Oh, you've opened that. That's a can of worms because so you can get all into the philosophy of expertise and professionalization of science, because scientist is a relatively new term in the history of humans. It's been used in our sense of it for 200 years ish. Before we were natural. Not we, but rich white men were natural philosophers. It's really complicated because if you want to take the easy route, you could say that to be a scientist, you have a degree in science and you do active research and you publish in journals that are accepted as academic peer-reviewed journals. You could go that route, but it's all gray. It's not as black and white as that. It's that balance between opening science up, but also making sure that science does operate to some certain standards and norms, like anything else in the world. We can't all be politicians.
That because you're right when it comes to just like a doctor, you want to I want to know that someone's a scientist. That means there's a certain amount of credibility that comes with that, the expertise, the PhD, the piece of paper and those letters after your name. That's not the significant part. It's that it represents years of training to become to understand the scientific method and to become a scientist. So it's not the degree that matters, but the work that it represents. And but then on the other hand, I like the idea that we can all be scientists in one way, but not in the way that when I really want to know the facts, I want the bar to be a little higher than just my neighbor who did a citizen science project. So that's a dilemma, but I like the way you said it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's exactly right. We think about being a scientist along a spectrum, and you can come in or out, or you can embody different roles in the process. And but that's a conversation for another time.
That is a tough one. And you know what? Tim asked if you've done other books about this history of science. This is her first book, but it probably won't be her last.
Even though I said I never wanted to write the first one, but
exactly.
The next one I would love to write is about commercial fossil collection. So buying and selling fossils, not necessarily the black market of fossils, because that's a bit dangerous, but just all about that.
This was a topic that I didn't know anything about until I worked at the museum and learned it from Lindsay, because it's the idea that so many fossils end up being sold in stores and museum stores and other stores, and that they're potentially scientific evidence that scientists would like to have the option, the access to explore, and should they be sold to the public? And I just saw Lindsay was quoted in an article because there was a dinosaur fossil that sold for some $30 million and no one knew who had bought it. This just recently happened, and it turns out it's a museum in Dubai. And there was some relief because all that people knew was that the fear from paleontologists like Lindsay was some rich private collector has acquired this amazing T-Rex and it's going to just end up in their living room or something of their mansion. And so I think she expressed her pleasure that it's going to be on display and shared with the world and be accessible by researchers.
Right.
So yeah, that's a tough thing because I have a couple trilobite fossils that I bought for $3 at a museum store, and I'm glad I have them, and they're available by the million. So so tough issue. Like so many issues.
It is.
Are like maybe this is ethics or something, but they're not so cut and dry.
That's right.
That there's a correct and incorrect answer.
That's right. Because if we want the public to be involved in science, or at least appreciate it, you have to make it available to them. But under what conditions? And then it's and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, just like I don't mean celebrity in a derogatory way, but it is about control and authority, because there do have to be some general standards. Like you said, you don't want just Joe Blow working on you. You want a doctor,
Yeah.
medical doctor. Yeah, not me.
And speaking of doctors, Fred asked do you appreciate Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, which in a way, not exactly de-extinction, but bringing back the dead.
Yeah.
In possibly what many people call the first science fiction novel.
Yes, yeah. So my answer would have to be, of course. Yeah, I more than appreciate her. But Jurassic Park is it's a part of that intellectual history that comes out of. I mean, that's part of that influence, not just as a science fiction novel, but this idea of tinkering with life, which is something else that has to do with a celebrity science. It's just it's not a finite interest in DNA from fossils. It's a bigger picture of how is life, what is life, how is it made, how does it go away, and how can we recreate it? And that's something that humans have been fascinated with for thousands of years. And Mary Shelley's book is just it's one piece in that bigger intellectual history.
You could have subtitled your book From Mary Shelley to Mary Schweitzer.
Oh, that's right. I would have had to do a lot more research, though.
Yeah, she's not enough of a celebrity yet that her name would mean anything there, but just a stupidly humorous thought.
But she's probably glad about that.
Right. So, well, that's amazing. Thank you, Elizabeth, for taking the time to talk to me and to talk to us. And congratulations on your first book.
Thank you.
It comes out tomorrow. So there's the book. It's available everywhere. Ancient DNA, The Making of a Celebrity Science, by Elizabeth Jones. Elizabeth, yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to wrap things up here. This was really fun. I want to thank everyone for your comments and questions. And Elizabeth Jones can be found at here's her little tag, on Twitter and Instagram, Dr. Dino DNA. Go check her out. And our theme music is by Logan Whitehurst. You can find him at loganwhitehurst.com. And also look for his artist page on Spotify. Tomorrow, I'll be speaking to an avian ecologist, Lauren Farr, about woodpeckers and prescribed burns and all sorts of cool stuff. See you next time.